next speaker will be David Owen, and David's talk is on STEM education in a culture of technology.
Right, so my name is David Owen, and I teach computer science at Messiah University in central Pennsylvania. A lot has changed since I submitted an abstract to be considered for last year's ASA meeting, including the name of my employer. So it actually says Messiah College in my abstract, where it should say Messiah University. So hopefully I don't get in too much trouble for that. Anyway, my training is in electrical engineering and computer science, not philosophy. So I'm speaking this afternoon as an amateur. I'm interested in philosophy of technology as it relates to my daily life and work, and to the broader context for subjects that I explore in class with my students. So my plan is to talk first about alternative views of technology that are typically presented by others, starting with the two extremes of determinism and instrumentalism, and then to suggest a middle view, not necessarily an original view, but something in the middle, as it might make sense in practice for developers versus users of a technological device. Next, I'll summarize Christian philosopher Albert Borgmann's idea of the device paradigm, and I'll talk about why Borgmann's way of thinking about technology might make sense for people like me familiar with software design principles, in particular the idea of abstraction, or more specifically information hiding, as we talk about that in computer science. In Borgmann's writing and in others writing along similar lines, there's the concern that as we spend more and more of our time interacting with technological devices, we will tend to expect similar kinds of interaction with non-technological things. So we are not just people who use particular devices for particular purposes. The pervasiveness of technology impacts our understanding of each other, of the natural world, and of God. So it's in this sense that you could say we are in a culture of technology, as distinct from people in other times or places who may have related to their tools in different ways. Finally, I'll present what I hope will be an encouraging and helpful way to resolve some of these concerns, anchored in my work as a STEM educator. I'll try to persuade you that geeks and Luddites have something in common, namely that neither is content to interact with technology merely as an uncritical user. And I'll suggest that all of us might benefit from a transformation from user to learner, facilitated by developers who think with learners, not just users in mind. So people who write about technology and culture often distinguish between determinism and instrumentalism. Technological determinism would be the pessimistic view, sometimes expressed in ominous rhetorical questions. For example, maybe you've heard people ask something along these lines: could it be that although we think that we are using our tools are in some sense using us? And there can certainly be wisdom in such questions, but I think sometimes I find it frustrating when a question like that is asked as sort of the end of the discussion. I want to think about, okay, well, what do we do about that? How can we take things further? On the other hand, there's the more optimistic instrumentalist view that technology is neutral, that users are free to use it in whatever way they see fit. This view may be refuted or dismissed by philosophers, but still seems to be very common in daily life. Developers, for example, who don't want to be blamed when the tools that they've created are misused, assume a form of this view. So what about something in the middle, something in between determinism and instrumentalism? Well, perhaps developers could choose to make devices that are less deterministic, more open to users' freedom or creativity, or to the extent that a device directs or constrains users to use it in a certain way, developers could take responsibility for that. Moreover, if it is possible for some technological devices to be less deterministic than others, perhaps users could be selective, favoring these more neutral devices and using them in creative, meaningful, and positive ways. Now, I'm going to show you a picture here. It was interesting in the previous, I like that in the previous presentation, there was a picture of a bridge also. So maybe this ties in some way, I don't know. But I'm curious whether any of you recognize this bridge or even know where it is. This is the bridge over the New River Gorge in southern West Virginia. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Less than a day's drive from here. My father would take us camping in West Virginia. And then I went to graduate school in West Virginia. So this part of the country is very familiar to me. Now I want to point out something obvious. For the people driving across this bridge, it doesn't look anything like what you see in this picture. From the top of the bridge, everything that you see here is hidden from view. If you want to see the bridge for what it is, to appreciate it in the context of the deep gorge and the scenic river below, you take the old road, winding slowly down to the bottom of the gorge, and cross the narrow wooden deck Fayette Station Bridge just above the water. In fact, I think this picture may have been taken from that bridge or somewhere nearby. Albert Borgmann has proposed what he calls the device paradigm as a framework for understanding the way we interact with technology in daily life. For Borgmann, a device is a technological product or service characterized by a strict separation between a user's experience, what Borgmann calls the commodity, and everything else that goes into creating this device and making it available to others, which he calls the machinery. A technological determinist might point out that this bridge, by making it so much easier to cross the gorge here versus anywhere else along the river, effectively determines where and how everyone will cross. Or an instrumentalist might point out that people crossing the river may have good or evil reasons for doing so. The same bridge could be used by EMTs or a family on vacation, or for transportation of illegal drugs or human trafficking. We would certainly not blame the builders of the bridge if it is sometimes used for bad things. But aside from determinism versus instrumentalism, my concern, consistent with Borgmann's ideas, is that users of a technological device may have very little understanding or appreciation for the human story of its development, which for me is kind of represented here by the structure of the bridge holding up the roadway, or for its context within nature and connection to God as the creator, which you could see maybe represented by the scenic gorge and the river below. Now I'm switching here a little bit, but I think I'll tie it in a second. Here's a quote, or maybe you'll see how it ties in, I don't know. Here's a quote from one of my favorite textbooks, Noam Neeson and Shimon Shokin's The Elements of Computing Systems. In computer science, we take the notion of abstraction very concretely, defining it to be a statement of what the entity does and ignoring the details of how it does it. This functional description must capture all that needs to be known in order to use the entity's services and nothing more. All the work, cleverness, information, and drama that went into the entity's implementation are concealed from the client who is supposed to use it, since they are simply irrelevant. Neeson and Shokin use the word abstraction here, but a more specific name for this as a design strategy would be information hiding. It's a key idea in object-oriented programming and really any kind of modular design. So maybe you can see then why Albert Borgmann's device paradigm idea makes sense to me as a way of thinking about how we interact with technology. It's practically the same thing, I think, as what I was taught and what I teach now about how to design a complex software system. The title of my presentation is STEM Education in a Culture of Technology. That phrase, a culture of technology, comes from Borgmann. It suggests that for us, as opposed to other people in other times and places, technology is not just about the devices we make and use, but about the way that we relate to each other, the way that we understand ourselves and our place in the world. Our interaction with nature is mediated by devices that tend to conceal their natural context as irrelevant to us as users. In our technologically mediated interaction with other people, via social media, for example, we present a simple, predictable, and desirable image of ourselves. And we may feel pressure to maintain this personal brand as if it were somehow more real than our physical in-person self, because it is superficially accessible to so many people. Moreover, our understanding of ourselves in relation to God is influenced by our daily interaction with technology. We may reduce Christianity to a magical faith of easy fixes, where a user-friendly God solves our problems, and we aren't expected to take an interest in the details. I don't really have time to do justice to these concerns in this presentation, but here are 3 references to books that I have been really helpful and influential for me in my thinking about these things. And also, I, of course, be happy to share with anyone that's interested. There's a longer essay that this presentation is based on. The user-friendly technological device, the elegant software module that hides its internal complexity behind a simple interface, as much as these ideals are promoted in advertising to potential users or in software design textbooks, they don't really tell the whole story. Developers who enjoy their work are motivated by curiosity. They aren't just developers, but geeks. They are interested in technology for its own sake, and not just because of what it might be able to do for them as a user. Now, if a geek, as I'm using the word here, is a person interested in technology for its own sake, apart from what it can do for the user, a Luddite is the opposite. A person who is skeptical of technology just because it's technology, apart from what it might be able to do for them if they choose to use it. Notice that the geek and the Luddite, each in their own way, reject Borgmann's device paradigm as a basis for interaction with technology. Neither is content to be a mere user. The geek is curious to understand the hidden complexity that makes it work. The Luddite is concerned about the possibility of unintended negative consequences. Like the geek's curiosity, the Luddite's concerns center on the systems and relationships behind the scenes that a typical user would rather not have to think about. When students are trained to be users, they are, not surprisingly, expected to focus on what a tool can do, not what it is, not where it comes from or how it works, etc. And even in fields where students are trained to be developers, they are often taught that what matters most about their work is whether it will be of use to others who are not expected to take any interest in its internal details or in the story behind its development. This might seem noble, for a developer to offer the benefits of their work in service to others with no strings attached, but I don't believe it's good for users or developers. We need to move beyond both the user role and the developer role to a sort of geeky Luddite role, which I'll call learner. A learner, in contrast to a user, is curious enough to invest time and energy to better understand how a frequently used technological tool works. So this is the geeky part. And a learner is interested in connections between a device and its social or environmental context, particularly those connections related to hidden long-term costs or unintended negative consequences. So that would be the Luddite part. These things can be modeled by educators. We will sometimes be excited about technology for its own sake, telling stories of creativity, discovery, and invention. We will sometimes be critical of technology, not just when it fails to work as advertised, but when its success may entail social or environmental harm. In any area where there is a tendency to model our interaction with something as if it were a device, that is, anytime we find ourselves acting as user, we can instead adopt a learner role, seeking to understand and appreciate the would-be device for its own sake on the one hand, or considering it critically within its social, environmental context on the other. So I'm going to close, this is my last slide, I'm going to close with this slide, which is a different view of the bridge over the New River Gorge in southern West Virginia. This picture was taken from an overlook near a visitor center not far from the highway. I want to suggest this as an analogy for a course in a STEM field. Imagine that students come to the course with some experience of the subject, but only indirectly, as users of some service or device that depends on content they will learn about in the course. They have mobile phones and they use them all the time, for example, but they don't know anything about programming or computer hardware. They are like drivers whose only experience of the bridge is the road on the top. It will not be possible in a single course to teach them very much about how the apps on their phone work, let alone the hardware of the phone, the infrastructure the phone depends on, natural resources consumed by its manufacturing and use, stories of people who developed it. There's just way too much. But as educators, we can invite students to stop, to get off the highway and to explore the visitor center. We can walk with them to the overlook and consider the structure of the bridge that supports the highway and connects it to the gorge below. They may or may not explore further on their own, but their experience of the bridge, when they use it in the future, will be different. They will think of the people who designed and built the structure beneath them. They will think of how technology is anchored in a natural context, how it impacts the world around it. And they may ultimately make connections between the human story, the natural context, and their creator, whose work is the foundation for it all.
Thank you very much, David. That was kind of mind expanding. Paul, you have a question.
Yes, very thought-provoking, David. Thank you. It occurs to me that possibly there's an analogy on this bridge picture is so interesting. There's an analogy where the brain is the superstructure of the bridge and consciousness is the road on top that just cruises on by. Have you ever thought about that?
I can't say that I have specifically, but it's interesting.
Because, you know, I'm 78 years old now, and I feel like I'm 20 years old. You know, in our heads, we don't, as long as we're healthy, we don't really change in our awareness of the world, but we're aging in reality. So, you know, it's just interesting how the brain fools us into thinking that this is a permanent experience.
Interesting comments, Paul. Thank you. Another question or comment? Bill, go ahead.
Yes, I thought what was most interesting were your two photographs of the bridge, how the perspective you look at something totally changes it. The one looking at from below makes it look beautiful. Speaking as an engineer, the second one makes me worried about it falling apart because everything looks like it's corroding away.
Yeah.
But a lot of technology, I think, is that way. Which direction you look at it, you come to a different conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if all you do is drive across the top of the bridge, you don't you don't get any of those perspectives, I guess.
Okay, we have time for one more. Derek, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your talk. I apologize, I missed a little piece of it. So excuse me if my question was already dealt with, but just wondering if you could comment. Like, I agree, these books are really helpful. This is the one of them you cited. I have a few of the others. What I find is a lot of Christians have addressed this sort of idea of determinism and, you know, how technology is neutral, instrumentalism. But a lot of the books tend to wring their hands at the end in despair and don't really have any practical advice for computer scientists or engineers, for that matter. A lot of philosophers tend to, you know, do a lot of hand wringing. I'm just wondering whether you found anything helpful for talking about how then shall we engineer and how then shall we write code in a way that avoids some of these pitfalls, but then also looks at some of the creative possibilities, you know, in creation that we can unfold with some of these tools. You know, sort of the positive side of, you know, how to proceed and how you share that with your students. If you had some thoughts.
Yeah.
Well,
David,
I guess,
if you have a very brief response.
well, this would be really brief, but I'd say you should read Derek's book. Your book almost made it into my list, but I just read it very recently. But I think that, I don't know if I'm being fair in summarizing it, but I think maybe part of the answer to your question is to think creatively as a developer about the choices you have. A lot of maybe the hand wringing comes from people whose only experience is as a user, and so they don't see that technology is an area that is open to the choices of how we're going to develop and what we're going to develop. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. Like people analyzing tools such as they are left with what they are, whereas the developer has the whole world of possibilities in front of them, and then how to act responsibly is the question. So thanks for mentioning my book. I wouldn't have done that on my own, but yeah, glad you found it helpful.
Thank you both very much.